million people displaced, hospitals bombed, children forced to flee for their lives, and a world apparently indifferent to their plight. That's the reality of life inside Syria's last rebel stronghold. This week, Sky News spent 48 hours there and found a city under siege with evidence of war crimes and an unfolding humanitarian disaster. In this special programme, we'll hear from the children, the mothers, the doctors, the fighters and the victims. And we'll hear the growing calls for international action to save the lives of those caught up in the horror. Inside Idlib.
At just 20 days old, Teslim's already endured unbearable hardship. She's desperately hungry. But her tiny stomach's so small she can barely ingest anything. She was born to a mother on the run and has spent her entire short life in a tent, so bitterly cold her heart all but stopped. And there are so many more like Teslim who are suffering. The doctors say about half a dozen babies come in every day, desperately undernourished or born prematurely to traumatise mothers. More than 70 hospitals have already been put out of action. This is one of the few left operating inside Idlib. Dr. Ikram is overwhelmed with young patients.
The situation is very bad. Bad to a very large extent.
She's a mother of two, pregnant again and clearly angry. In her office she breaks down, furious at the inaction by the world's leaders.
وين الإنسانية؟ شلون عم تحسنوا بتناموا؟ شلون عم تحسنوا بتاكلوا؟ شلون عم تحسنوا بتشربوا؟ وانتم شايفين كل هالملايين من الناس هيك عم بيصير فيها، مشان شو؟ وانتم قادرين توقفوا هذا الشيء.
But the bombing isn't stopping. Listen to that breathing. There's real terror about another attack on the same place. It's a common tactic. Somehow the elderly owner walks out alive. It's Syria's most vulnerable who are most affected. And those first on the scene worry every time about seeing the dead and injured.
I thank God many times that there's like, well, there's just one old woman.
Are they saying something about the drone? That's more than a drone now, that's now aircraft. The aircraft has gone now. You can see the sense of trepidation. Whenever a drone comes up, then an aircraft comes, a jet comes, and they think, right, we're going to be next. It's terrorising. Close by, a hospital's hit a short time later. Spotters have seen the aircraft and the patients have been shifted. All the parties in this conflict are given GPS locations for the medical facilities here. Attacking hospitals is an international war crime.
They want us to be killed. They don't want to hear us. They want us to be killed in silence.
The fighting and war crimes on both sides have prompted mass movement of families trying to get out of the battlefield. And they're still moving, the bulk of them women and children. And as the regime troops close in, they're running out of places to run to. Turkish troops are in Idlib, threatening to take on the regime, whilst politicians scramble to stop all-out war. For the civilians, war's already here, and from the very old to the very young, here at least, they fear Bashar al-Assad. Children far too knowledgeable about war, whilst Idlib burns, with no end yet in sight.
our hospital receive an enormous number of patients who have been recently displaced. So we work around the clock to accommodate all patients who visit our facility. And so, as you know, that Northwest Syria represents now one of the world's most humanitarian crises. And in the middle aspect, the situation is disastrous as the Syrian regime attacked hospital deliberately. The situation is too difficult for us. We are unable to meet the needs for our patients, as the lack of funds and the lack of equipment we received from the international community. We expect famine and communicable diseases and, unfortunately, babies dying from the weather, from sub-zero temperature. We are preparing ourselves for all the scenarios in the future and to evacuate our hospital and to relocate to other parts. But we will still here in Idlib with our people, with the civilians, to save lives as possible as we can. We know we risk our lives to help the civilians, the injured people, and we go to our work knowing that we may not return our homes. Simply, that's our duty. The majority of injuries and our casualties that were civilians, and the vast majority of them were war-related injuries. However, as our hospital have to cover now 1 million displaced people near the borders, we have to cover all other diseases such as chronic disease, but the majority is war-related injuries.
I worked with Dr. Omar for several years now, 2012, 13, 14, 16, and I was with him in July last year, training him with the other doctors as well. They've always had a problem with shortage of materials and lots of problems with getting blood and helping patients and so on and so forth. And it's always been a huge problem for them. I mean, it's okay to give them all the advice you can possibly give them to dealing with fragmentation wounds and gunshot wounds and so on. But if you haven't got the equipment as well to deal with it, then it's a big problem. And of course, what they've got now is thousands upon thousands of injured people who they're trying to deal with hardly any equipment. I'm really astounded that it's just got as bad as it has. I mean, the Syrian government and the Russian regime and the Iranians are totally out of control, and they're being allowed to almost exterminate countless hundreds and thousands of Syrian civilians. And of course, when you think about it, 70% of all the people, the civilians, are women and children. Never mind the problem that women have, that they're probably pregnant, they've got no hospitals to go to. 18 of the hospitals they had several weeks ago have now been destroyed. There's only 3 left, and certainly Bab al-Hawa, where I was when the people came up from Aleppo, and they were in a dreadful state in 2016. I operated on many of those with Dr. Omar when they all came up, and they're only people you ever see are in fact civilians. You don't see any of the so-called jihadists, and you're only operating on children and women and old people. And that's what the problem is. And it's a real ordeal for everybody. And I have a suspicion that if we don't do anything about it in the next few weeks, then there could be close to 1 million people losing their lives. It's as bad as that. We need to cut across the lines, because if nobody else is doing anything, we just can't sit back and watch the catastrophe that's unfolding in front of us and listen to Dr. Omar, who calls me every day to say that the situation is getting worse and worse and worse, and they've run out of money, they've run out of equipment, they've run out of everything. And I personally can't feel that I can sit here and listen to him crying to me every day, and we've got to do something, and the West really now need to do something. And I think the West are sitting back and they're running away, and I wish they wouldn't.
Viewed from Turkey, the war in Syria is threatening to burst its banks. In these camps are hundreds of thousands of Syrians who know the Assad regime is closing in, and they're cornered, pressed up against Turkey's border. The UN says they're now being bombed and shelled in the camps, prompting the starkest of warnings.
There are about 1 million displaced people living in camps and makeshift shelters in that area. And you know, if the shelling and airstrikes move any further into that area, we're going to see a bloodbath. We're going to see a massacre on a scale that has never been seen during this entire war.
A complete humanitarian collapse in Idlib could force hundreds of thousands of Syrians across this border and threaten a repeat of Europe's migrants crisis. The other looming danger, an escalating conflict between Turkey and Syria and Russia, could do the same. And that is looking increasingly likely. Column after column of Turkish heavy armour is being sent to the border. An offensive is imminent, says Turkey, after talks with Russia broke down, threatening a whole new chapter in this devastating conflict. In an orphanage, we were shown how Syrian children are told to draw what they wish for as therapy for the trauma of losing their homes and parents.
Yahya, for example, wished to go to paradise, to see his fathers and mothers, because the father and the mother there in paradise.
Therapist Bayan is from Idlib and deeply worried about those she left behind.
Because the people where they go, the Turkish or Turkey here, they didn't open the door. Where the children or the women or the persons will go, it's no place. And what's it's mean? It's mean the Assad will kill all our life peoples now. There is no place. Really, it's no place to go.
There's no place left.
No.
هي يوم تحرير راعي.
This is from a Rai liberation battle.
Right.
Where ISIS
مع داعش.
He was
لما حررنا الراعي.
So he fought against Daesh.
We met Syrian rebel commander Ahmed Barry, who fought Islamic State after defecting from the Assad regime. He expected the world to intervene years ago, he said, and stop Assad, and has now almost given up hope.
إلى الآن ما عجب ما انتهوا أو ما شبعوا من منظر الشعب الذي يقتل في سوريا. شعبنا في سوريا يقتل يوميا. إلى متى بده يضلوا صامتين وساكتين أمريكا وبريطانيا وفرنسا وألمانيا والدول العظمى؟ لأنه اللي صار بسوريا ما صار بغير مكان. إلى متى هذا؟
The world has wrung its hands, apparently impotent to stop Syria's carnage, for almost a decade. But over this border is a killing zone where millions are now trapped. At this 11th hour, will it now act?
I think the important thing to remember is that the UN wants to act, and 13 members of the Security Council want to act, but were stopped from acting because of Russia, supported by China. That's the main thing, to get the Russians to restrain the Syrians and to stop aiding them in the bombings that they're doing, including bombings of hospitals, which is against the Geneva Convention. We've had the Secretary General, we've had the High Commissioner for Human Rights pleading for this to stop and for there to be a ceasefire. That's a call that we back. We're very ready to do what we can to support a UN-led ceasefire, but Russia would need to agree, and that's the bit that's missing. I think it's important to remember that the Turks have lost soldiers because of a Syrian offensive, and also that the Turks have been trying to get a ceasefire, or at least a cessation of hostilities, in place. I think the veto does work in certain circumstances. The real problem is that the Russians abuse it to protect someone like Assad, who is attacking his own people.
Idlib is the last bastion of rebel fighters, many of whom are allied to al-Qaeda. But it's also become a haven for people fleeing the fighting in other parts of Syria who have seen the destruction the regime has inflicted. In April, Syria's President Bashar al-Assad amplified his attacks on those rebels who had escaped to Idlib. By November, although a significant swathe of territory was recaptured, the conflict ramped up even further and the violence intensified. In the subsequent months, pro-Assad forces have captured dozens more villages, pushing the rebels back into a smaller and smaller area. As the front line has moved, the internally displaced people have had an increasingly limited space to seek sanctuary. As the pro-Assad forces pushed into Idlib, those displaced populations were caught in the crossfire. In the early phase in May, 18 hospitals in the northwest were hit within the space of 2 weeks. The Rahma hospital was struck 4 times by warplanes allied to the Syrian government. Russian planes are operating in Syria, but Russia denies any attacks on civilians. As the front line has moved, refugees have an increasingly limited space to seek sanctuary. In the last few months, according to the United Nations, some 800,000 people have been forced to leave their homes. There are now thousands of people streaming across northwestern Syria, desperate to find somewhere they can shelter.
In the desperation and deprivation of war, it is possible to find joy in the smallest things. For 10-year-old Abdul Rahman and his 12-year-old sister Ragad, that joy is the bicycle they share. For months now, theirs has been a life on the move. A life fleeing bombing and death. A life with an eye always on the skies, looking and listening for what is coming next. They and their bike, somehow, so far, surviving.
مسكنا الطيران وجينا طلعنا على هيك مو بعيد عنا، مو بعيد كثير، بعيد شوية. طلعنا على ضيعة اسمها حاس، بركنا كمان صار علينا الضرب كثير، رجعنا على كل بيت. أهل الضيعة ما كويسة علينا، يعني صعوبة كثير. هيك فرقنا عمامنا، فرقنا كل أهل الصبوا، نحن مع ابن حسين. هلا أنا وأخي كمان صابته تقطق في الحكي، ما بيحسن الغصف. كثر ما سمع الغصف هيك صابته هيك تقطق فيه، ما بيحكي بس بيتقطق بالحكي. عاد أخاف الطيارة وقت إن تجي وتضربنا هيك نخاف كثير، وبدنا نروح على أطمة. هناك ما بضرب بطول، بدنا نروح على أطمة.
They are the waves of the innocent, the unknowing. For the truth is, they have a long and dangerous road in front of them. Often it is best to travel by night, out of sight of those who would do them harm. And every stop, even in the darkness, has its small mercies. After several hours, they arrive at the camp where their cousins have already taken refuge. Ragad and Abdul Rahman have made this journey with their uncle. Their mother and father have stayed behind in the last place they called home. They pray they will come in the next few days.
أمان أكثر من هنيك، وبكرة نصير نلعب بالبسكليت أنا ما أولاد عمامي.
In the tent, they play a game to take their minds off war. Who knows where these young feet will have to carry them next? Mark Austin, Sky News, on the Syria-Turkey border.
We've lost about 7 children frozen to death, according to the United Nations. An absolutely biblical exodus of people from their homes, 130,000 in the space of 3 or 4 days, 900,000 over the space of 3 months. And I think, frankly, The pictures that you are showing, the stories that you're telling, should really shame the countries that are both perpetrating the crimes that we're seeing, the bombing of hospitals and health centres, the bombing of civilians fleeing, but also those countries who are turning away and saying that there's nothing that they can do. This now is a threat not just to the civilians on the ground, but to the peace and security of the whole region, never mind to Europe, because of course, if there is to be a further exodus across the border into Turkey, that will rebound into Europe, and that's why it demands the highest level of attention. It's a complicated situation. There are terrorist forces. They used to be called Jabhat al-Nusra. Now it's Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. It's a branch of al-Qaeda. We are told there are 10 to 15,000 of those buried amongst the civilians. But then you have a range of other groups, non-state actors, some of which are linked to Turkey, some of which have been moved from other parts of Syria. Because remember, the 3 million people in Idlib province at the moment constitute 1.5 million people from Idlib, and then 1.5 million people from elsewhere in the country. So it's a highly complicated situation. But that just raises the point that simply bombing from the air, missile strikes on hospitals and civilians, that's not going to undermine the terrorist position. And so I think anyone who cares about the longer-term stability, never mind the short-term humanitarian need, has got to recognize that this bombing and missile campaign is a complete dead end. The world is failing, not just washing its hands. The world is not working effectively diplomatically, but nor is the humanitarian work going on in the right kind of way. There aren't enough trucks going over, there aren't enough medical supplies. For goodness sake, you've got 50,000 people literally living under trees in circumstances where it's -7 to -11 degrees centigrade. If that isn't a shame and a disgrace in the 21st century, I don't know what is.
So it really doesn't bear thinking about what it must be like for hundreds of thousands of people stuck between the fighting and this border that remains resolutely closed. It may be the final onslaught, but it is by no means the end of the misery.